Hello, my friends, and welcome. This is going to be the first part of a series of videos on creating surreal composite photography. So we're going to focus this series on a specific image that I made so that you can kind of follow along and actually see in action how this works rather than just listening to me talk about it. So in this first video, we're just going to talk about the pre-production process. And essentially, this consists of any sort of planning that leads up to you creating your actual image or beginning the actual production process. So for me, this usually starts with inspiration for an image. And I do want to talk about this because I know that people sometimes struggle to find inspiration. So I feel like there's times when we all struggle to find inspiration, and I do want to preface anything that I'm about to say here with the fact that no matter how involved you are with the things that we're going to be talking about, you're still going to occasionally experience sort of a block. You could call it like a writer's block or an artist block or something like that, where you just need a little time and a little bit of probably relaxation, a little bit of just letting go of whatever it is that you're trying to get done, and just letting yourself kind of process and letting those things work themselves out in your subconscious mind. So everyone goes through that, and that's to be expected. And usually these periods will pass, most likely fairly quickly. But if you're you just don't know how to find inspiration at all, or you're struggling to find any kind of inspiration for your creative work, this is probably because you're really not engaging with any kind of creative work yourself. So artists, there's sort of this myth about the artist, that the artist is like this original, that they just create out of the brilliance of their imagination and it just happens. But this is completely inaccurate. All artists, even those that we consider to be groundbreaking in the way that they do their work, use other art as inspiration. So if you want to feel inspired, you need to be constantly engaging with art. So this could mean just engaging with the work of other photographers or painters or whatever it is, visual arts wise. It could also mean watching films. It can mean reading books. So for me, reading is a huge part of what creates inspiration for me. I like to work off of sort of big ideas. This is just the way that I work, and everyone is different. So just because this is the way that I do it doesn't mean that it's going to be the way that you do it. But the only way you're really going to be able to discover how you work and what works for you is by engaging with these things and then just trying it out and seeing, like, where am I finding my inspiration? Is it coming from taking a morning hike, or is it coming from reading a particular book? Maybe it's a novel, or maybe it's like a more philosophical or psychological work or something like that. Or did I get it from looking at the images of some of my favorite artists? Whatever it is that kind of sparks your imagination, you need to be testing that out. And the only way that you're going to be able to figure it out is by engaging with art. So in the particular image that we're going to be building for this video series, I'm going to talk to you about how I came up with my inspiration. And I'm going to consult my notebook a little bit here, so if I'm looking down, that's why. So for me, a big inspiration for this image was the work of Carl Jung. So I started reading a very small book of his called The Undiscovered Self. It's very short. I think it's like 100 pages or something like that. And then now I'm reading his memoir, which is super interesting and has a lot of dream imagery in it, which for me is very helpful because I actually don't really remember my dreams a lot. This is something that I would like to work on, but I don't really remember my dreams that often. I'm not like one of these people who gets inspiration from dreams. I wish I was, but it's interesting to read Carl Jung's dreams because he has some pretty bizarre imagery in them. But yeah, so that's part of where my inspiration came from. Also, there's this idea in Jung about the relationship, specific to this image, about the relationship between ego conscience, so like your conscious part of your personality, and the unconscious. So in Jungian psychology, there's this process that he calls individuation, and essentially it's a process of discovering how to find a sort of union and a harmony between the conscious daily reality and the unconscious. And a lot of what he does in order to find that sort of conversation between those two parts of the mind is dream work. So this idea of like finding that connection between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind was a huge inspiration for this image. So that's a big part. And then also there was an Alice Wellinger drawing. I think that I'm saying her name right. It's a crayon drawing. She does crayon drawings, which is really interesting. And she's an incredible artist. And I just found this image so interesting of these two figures just with their hands over each other's faces. So as you will see, this was a huge inspiration for this image. And then finally, the work of Rene Magritte, who, if you follow me at all, you know that I talk about him all the time. So Rene Magritte has a painting called Black Magic. And in that painting, there's a figure where the top portion of the body is turning sort of this bluish color, like almost as if the figure is blending into the sky behind them. And then the bottom portion is flesh toned. So you'll see again that this is also partially inspiring this image, and just cloudy skies in general, because you see a lot of blue skies with clouds in a lot of Magritte imagery. These are all the little things that I came across that ultimately led me to the idea for this image. So as I said, in order to come up with this idea, I needed to be engaging with these things. I needed to be reading a book. I needed to be looking at the art of Rene Magritte. I needed to be looking at the art of other more contemporary artists, which I follow a ton of on Instagram. So that's a really good way to find contemporary artists who do really amazing work, and also just reading blogs. So This is Colossal is a huge art blog that you've probably heard of. Also, I think My Modern Met, and just, you know, follow people who are showing you different artists and introducing you to art that you might not have known about before. So that is where we really get our inspiration. And also another huge one for me, which I kind of touched on a little bit, is physical activity. And this is because it taps into your unconscious. When you're doing sort of a rote activity, like going on a jog or a bike ride or a hike, or even maybe like gardening or something like that, if you're not into like sort of more exercise type activities, doing some gardening or doing just anything where you can just turn your brain off and just kind of do that task without thinking about it too much. That's when your unconscious mind kind of clicks in and the thoughts start bubbling up. So, or even like in the shower, you'll hear people say that they are suddenly inspired with new ideas while they're in the shower. It's because you're tapping into the unconscious there. You're just doing an activity that doesn't require you to think about it too hard. And because of that, these things, these images, these ideas that are kind of drifting around somewhere in your unconscious are allowed to bubble up to the surface, where they aren't really if you're trying too hard to kind of think about a problem or think about something. And this is something that was very important to a lot of big thinkers and also artists. So people like Salvador Dali and also Thomas Edison, who we all know was an inventor. So these are all things to think about when looking for inspiration. Now, other things to consider in preparation are things like sketches or mock-ups. So I don't always do this. I'm not great at drawing. This is something that I actually want to make a goal of mine to improve upon in the next year or so. but I'm not great at drawing, so I don't always sketch. Sometimes I will, and I'll just make a horrible sketch, but at least it makes sense to me. Another thing you can do is you can bring images into Photoshop and create like a Photoshop mockup, and that's it doesn't have to look perfect. Obviously, that's not the idea. It's just to give you an idea of where you want to place the elements in your scene. So that's an important thing to do when planning for an image, or you can kind of just visualize it and then give it a try and see what happens, which is usually probably more how I work. I kind of have this vision in my mind of how I want the image to look, and then I just start collecting the pieces and putting them together, and sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. But no matter how much planning you do, that's going to be the case. So once you have a general idea of what you want your image to be, then you can make a little shot list for yourself. Like, what are the different parts that I need? I need a background. What's the background going to be? It's probably important to start often with the background, because the background is that's the whole setting. That's the setup for the whole thing. And it's going to dictate, as we'll see in the next videos here, how the whole image is executed. So it's important to look for a background first. If you don't start with a background, that doesn't mean that, that's not okay. It just means that it may be a little more tricky, because then you're going to have to try to find a background that will fit your image rather than the other way around. And it seems to be a little easier to have the background and then fit the other pieces into that background. So these are all things to consider. And I do want to definitely stress that you have to accept the possibility that it might not work at all and choose to do it anyway. And accept that maybe that means that you'll be doing reshooting, because I reshoot all the time. Like, I'll have an idea, I'll go try it out, and I can see that there's something there, but it's not quite working. And so then I realize what the mistakes were that I made. And so I go back and I reshoot it, having this new knowledge, and now I have something that does work. So this happens fairly frequently in my particular process. And you have to be willing to accept that that's a part of it, is just knowing that you're not always going to get it right the first time. Sometimes you're going to have to go back and do it again. Or sometimes you're going to have to completely say, you know what, that just didn't work at all, and move on to something else. And just being prepared to do that. So I think we covered most of what you need to consider in your pre-production process. Let's just talk a little bit about the idea that I had for this image. Right now I'm calling it Contact. That might change, but at the moment that's what I'm calling it. And I wanted to use the Alice Wellsinger idea of having a figure covering the other figure's face. So what I decided is I'm going to have two figures that are doubles. So it's going to be, I'm going to do a self-portrait as I frequently do. So I'm going to be the subject, and there's going to be two of me facing each other. And one of the me's is going to place their hand over the other's face. But the other one will not have a hand over their face. So only one figure will be reaching out and placing their hand over the other's face, and they'll be facing each other. And I don't want to, just tell you like blatantly what my thinking is here, but essentially going on that inspiration from Carl Jung about the unconscious and the conscious mind, the idea here is something like this conversation between the conscious and the unconscious. So I'm going to have the two figures. I have chosen a background from my own image archives, which is, it's just an oceanscape with these heavy, heavy clouds on one side, and then they're kind of lightening as they move towards the other side of the frame, and there's some blue sky on one side of the frame, and then there's just water, there's no waves, it's just like flat water stretching out in front of that, and there's a lot of pink and blue colors in this scene. So that's an image of mine, a landscape image of mine that I've always really loved and wanted to find something to do with. So I felt like it would fit this image and that sort of Magritte vibe very well. So I'm going to place my figures into this background, And then the last thing that I am going to do is that I want to have it so that one figure is blue and the other one is pink, and that the figure that's covering the other figure's face, that some of the color from the one with the hand on the face is kind of bleeding on to the arm of that figure. So that's the general idea that I'm starting with, and I'm going to build my image from there. So in the next video, we will start talking about some of the things that we need to plan for in order to execute our shoot properly, so that our figures and everything else that we have in our scene will all fit together and we can get a nice, believable image.